idea. All right.
I'm Andy Nidell, and welcome to the second part of this two-part special on Soviet armor in 1941. As you will no doubt know from last time, Chieftain is handling things here. This week he is covering medium and heavy tanks, so a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4.
Where do we sit on mediums? Though on the way out, you still had to be concerned if you're going up against T-28s. These tanks, by now, are considered obsolete, with their replacements, heavy tanks, under construction. Though medium tank, they were so called mainly because of the existence of T-35. The T-28 was used in the breakthrough role supporting other units, so if you met one, you were probably meeting everything the Red Army had in the area. Experience in Finland being taken into account, the original 3 centimeters of armour being found perhaps a bit wanting, an up-armouring program saw applique armour added to make 5 to 8 centimeters thick from the front, 4 on the sides and rear. When also combined with the higher velocity 76mm L10 gun, it would prove to be a very nasty opponent for anything it met. Bear in mind this tank also has a fully powered 3-man turret with a basket. For the standards of when it was designed, this is not a bad tank at all. On the other hand, this also meant that the tank had gone from 25 tons to 32, was too long to be nimble, and was just damn big. In something of a foreshadowing of what the Germans were to suffer from a couple of years later, a very significant number of T-28s were lost not due to enemy action, but due to logistical or mechanical issues. 410 of them were still in service in June of 1941 out of the 500 originally built. About 300 of them had the L10 gun. Like almost every other tank in Western units, they did not tend to last beyond August, although a few would crop up here or there as late as 1943. There is only one other medium tank to talk about, the T-34. T-34, of course, is the icon of the Red Army of World War II and would prove to be an excellent tank for the Soviets. But not during Barbarossa. They were steamrollered just like every other tank the Soviets had. About 935 were on hand for the German invasion. They were being knocked out by Panzer 38Ts by lunchtime, and by 5 weeks later, even with 526 replacements delivered, only 158 T-34s remained on the front line. Now, if you're the sort of person who's watching this video, you probably already know about T-34's positive points. Good flotation on capable running gear, 76mm gun capable against both tanks and anti-tank guns, well-sloped armour, a diesel engine and power pack at the rear, good cold and mud operation. Unfortunately, a vast improvement over the BT from which it was descended though it may have been, it was still in teething trouble phase, exacerbated by a lack of training. Again, the piper needs to be paid for these capabilities. The loss of internal volume caused by the Christie suspension system resulted in a cramped vehicle never really resolved throughout T-34's production. Something which was eventually resolved was the poor turret. Remember, T-34 was derived from A-32, which is more or less derived from A-20 and was considered to be basically a BT-type vehicle with a 76mm stuck into the same turret where the 45mm originally was, plus a bit more armour. The turret was not ideal with a 45mm, you can imagine what happens when you stick a 76 in there, even with power traverse. Unfortunately, this vehicle was designed before T-50's 3-man turret, and the 2-man crew were almost blind, although they at least did have periscopic and telescopic sights. The rate of fire was atrocious. Under ideal conditions, the Soviets rated it as 6 rounds per minute, but in practice, the Soviets concluded that it was really 2 rounds per minute. Further, the radios weren't the most reliable to coordinate between tanks. The L-11 wasn't a terrible gun, but the call went out very quickly to replace it with the far better F-34. The Germans didn't have any more difficulty really dealing with T-34s than they did the French tanks the year previously. The whole door knocker thing is a bit overstated. The Germans did have to do it the hard way, but do what they did. That first battle, on that first day at Alatus, 27 of 44 T-34s and 46 other tanks, including T-28s, were lost. The Germans lost 11 Panzer 38Ts, although admittedly they did bring an anti-tank unit along with a dozen long 5cm guns, and they also brought along some airplanes for good measure. But still, if you are blundering, blind and deaf, kept under your armour by artillery and airstrikes, you are going to make yourself vulnerable to a more mobile, better coordinated enemy. Assessments of damaged vehicles indicate that the Germans tended to wait for flank shots. This was not helped by the standard of training. Only 50 T-34s had been operated before the war started. All the others were kept in war readiness in the motor pool to avoid breaking them. In 1941, on the test stand, the engine had a life expectancy of 100 hours. In the field, driven roughly by a driver suffering from pretty terrible driving ergonomics, this would be less. If they trained with the tank would break and would no longer be able to be used, and it would look bad on your reports. There is a photo of a T-34 going into battle with a spare transmission on the back deck. Doesn't say great things. In 1941, this tank was not where it needed to be. They will get better, don't worry. Check back with me in a couple of years. Actual causes of losses vary. 5th Tanks lost over half of its T-34s in combat at Alatus, mentioned above. 32nd Tanks lost half of its vehicles due to mechanical breakdown. 10% were shipped to the rear, 10% bogged down, and 30% were lost in combat. 8th Mechanized Corps started the war with 100 T-34s in its base. 5 never made it out the gate, 40 dropped off to the side of the road during the road march. 10th Tanks lost only 16% of its T-34s due to mechanical breakdown, the rest were lost in combat. 50th Tanks lost almost half of its T-34s stuck in marshes. Yes, there are stories of T-34s taking ridiculous punishment, but much like Bilot's run at Stun, they also indicate the problems with the tank. One T-34 was hit 23 times by a 37mm gun from the front before a hit to the turret ring sent it home. In the movies, after the first 1 or 2 shots ricochet off the tank, the 76mm gun will turn, lay on the German AT gunners, and then there will be this dramatic pause, a close-up of the shock on the German faces, and then a muzzle blast from the Soviet tank would cut the scene. The T-34 was too blind to see the target in this case. Another example, 4th September 1941, a political officer, Veniaminov, brought his T-34 home with 70 impacts from 37mm and 75mm guns, including one which knocked the driver's hatch off, which would probably have been a significant emotional event for him. What is not mentioned so often is that his tank was the sole survivor of the 4 T-34s, 1 BT-7 and 2 T-26s, which came back after a failed attack. Now, I say these things not to disparage T-34. Again, T-34 will be the tank which will win the war for the Red Army. Spoiler alert, an excellent design for the Soviet circumstances. In 1941, though, this tank was hampered by design flaws, mechanical unreliability, and atrociously trained crews, and it was absolutely nowhere near as effective as the common story would have one believe. That done, on to the heavy tanks. There are only 2 to be concerned about. A tank which wasn't particularly unreliable, but which was a monstrosity which should have never been built in the first place, was T-35. Only about 60 were made, 48 were on hand for the German invasion. This supposed rolling fortress, with effectively the T-28's turret and machine gun turrets together with a couple of T-26 turrets thrown in for good measure, had ridiculously poor armour for the weight, with only a couple of combat engagements to its credit. Even though they were more reliable than T-34, which wasn't hard, running them for hundreds of kilometers without servicing did for the majority of them. This now leaves us with one tank, the KV. Unlike the T-34, going around the back or the side of this one did not really present much of an easier target for this 45-ton beast. Even the long 5cm gun needed to get up close with tungsten ammunition to take it out. The torsion bar suspension provides an excellent ride without sacrificing interior volume. Selected for production just before the Winter War, about 530 KVs were available when the Germans came to visit. They will be distributed in tank divisions. On paper, in a division, you'd have 210 T-34s, 147 BT-7s, 63 KVs, and an assorted amount of armoured cars and so on. And also you would find a battalion of 31 KVs in each tank regiment. But that almost never happened. In reality, just over 500 KVs were on hand for the German invasion. About a third of them were KV-2s with the bunker-busting 152mm gun and obscene silhouette, not of great use in manoeuvre fighting. It can be argued if German propaganda failed Germany yet again. After conquering France, they made sure to show how they were able to defeat even the highly regarded, heavily armoured Char B-1s. This made the Soviets question whether their KVs were actually tough enough. With 75mm of sloped armour at 30 degrees, they absolutely were tough enough, but just in case, a crash program for up-armouring was started, adding another couple of centimetres to the front and sides. It probably didn't make any practical difference to the Germans, but the KV just had a bunch of weight added to it. KV-1 model 1941 came with thicker armour from the factory. This leads to multiple stories of KVs acting as roadblocks for entire German formations, except this time the reputation for invulnerability is actually a little bit more deserved. Like most heavy tanks, a penalty was to be paid for the weight of armour. The transmission in particular was horrible, and it basically had the same 100-hour service life on the engine as T-34. 10th Tanks, which earlier had lost 16% of T-34s to mechanical breakdown, lost 44% of its KVs the same way. 8th Tanks lost 13 in combat, 2 in swamps, and 28 abandoned to breakdown. There are also a surprising number, or maybe not so surprising all things considered, of photographs showing KVs in rivers after the bridge that they were crossing failed to hold their weight. The vehicle was very tiring to drive, trying to maneuver a 45-ton tank without power assist, and the gearbox was not exactly smooth. The quality of the optics was below standard, and the layout inside was not much better. The Germans would report these tanks to be lumbering as if blind. Probably because they were. In theory, the tank had a 5-man crew with a 3-man turret. In practice, the layout made the 5th man almost useless, and 4-man crews were not uncommon. There was no turret basket. The commander also functioned as the loader. He had no hatch to stick his head out of, and his vision was fairly limited to just being to the periscope to his front, one to his right, a fixed one, and a view slit. He could, in theory, swap positions with the rear machine gunner, also officially known as the driver mechanic, and stick his head out the hatch at the rear for whatever he could see beyond the bulk of the turret to his front. But if he closed the hatch, he could only see out the rear, so commanders didn't really do that too much. So in KV we have a very tough tank, albeit slow, one which could be dangerous if well handled, and oftentimes KV crews were actually hand-picked so that they could get the best out of them. On the other hand, they would only be dangerous if they could get to the fight, which they frequently couldn't, and a lost tank is a lost tank regardless of cause. You will notice I haven't mentioned self-propelled artillery to include self-propelled anti-tank vehicles. Well, that's because there weren't any. There were certainly a number of prototypes trialed, but nothing would be adopted for service until next year. This leaves just one oddity of the Soviet army, the armoured trains. Trains have a great advantage, at least if properly constructed, of not being stuck in terrain just because it started to rain or the snow has melted, which is a useful capability on the Russian front, and the Soviets put quite a bit of thought into this problem. Some were rail cars made by simply putting a conversion kit onto the BA-6 or the BA-10 armoured cars. On the other hand, there were nearly 200 conventional locomotive-hauled armoured trains in service, about half of them being anti-aircraft oriented. Mostly they had about 2 centimeters of armour. In the middle were the rail cars, self-propelled fighting vehicles on rails, such as the BTD, which was basically a T-26 turret and a couple of guns on an armoured 2-axle body. Most impressive were the 32 rail cruisers, larger multi-turreted cars which literally would look like a naval warship sailing across the plains. Most were the D2 with twin 76mm turrets, but the MBV-2 was a monster. 80 tons of rolling steel with 3 T-28 turrets and a bunch of machine guns powered by the T-28's engine at up to 120 km an hour and a crew of up to 40. Both of these rail cars were used near Leningrad and proved to be a nuisance for the rest of the war. One was still in service in 1951 before finally being retired to Kubinka, where it is still on display. They ended up being something of a dead end though, just those two were built. So that about covers it. The Red Army's armoured vehicles during the initial desperate fighting after the German invasion. Hope you found it interesting and informative. Take care.
So that was Soviet medium and heavy armor in 1941. Again, a pretty mixed bag, and the Soviets still haven't fully perfected their armored warfare. Most interesting is that the mighty T-34 kind of isn't necessarily all that mighty here in 1941. However, those T-34s will go on to play a very big role in the years to come. And of course, I wanted to say big thanks to Chieftain for doing these specials with us. He really knows his stuff, and he's a nice guy, and he's good on camera. So what more do you want? Well, there is plenty more armor-related stuff to talk about, and as this war goes on, I'm sure that he and I will... Hello, and welcome to our Soviet Armor Special. I am, of course, Indy Nidell. We thought our good friend Chieftain could handle this one. He's, kind of an expert on these things. And this episode is on the armored cars and light armor of the Soviet Union in 1941. The next episode, which will be part 2, will be on medium and heavy armor. I will let Chieftain introduce things further. All right, take it away.
Greetings all. I have now covered the various German early war vehicles a couple of times, which allows us the luxury of focusing a video a bit more specifically on what the Soviets had to play with. My previous video on the development of Soviet doctrine covers more what the Soviets expected the vehicles to do. Indy's video covers overall the vehicles available to both sides, but this is more of an introduction to their capabilities. This video thus fills in that gap on what they can actually do. I guess before I dig into this, I ought to re-emphasize a point which is often lost. I'm doing videos on armoured vehicles for 2 reasons. Firstly, because they're cool and they attract a lot of attention, including mine. Secondly, because it's my area of expertise. If I'm going to do a video, it's probably going to be on armour. However, despite all the press, they are not the sole criterion, even just of hardware, for success or failure. So for example, the Red Army considered artillery to be the god of war. The US calls it the king of battle. Entire volumes can be written on artillery capabilities to include towing vehicles, ammunition resupply, fire direction, fusing, and so on, without which the job of the tanks becomes much harder. That caution out of the way, we'll start out with light armor and the armored cars. Of course, the first concern about armored cars is their mobility on Soviet terrain. This was recognized by the Soviets with their heavy emphasis on light tanks. But still, the armoured cars could provide quite a rapid punch, and many of them could be turned into ersatz half-tracks with the addition of attachable tracks around the rear wheels of a 3-axle armoured car. Their main advantage, though, is, well, frankly, they're cheap. One of the oldest in service was the BA-27 of that year. The vast majority of the 215 or so manufactured were still in service in 1941, but on their way out. I'm not going to spend any particular time on this vehicle. It was basically a Fiat F-15 truck with an armoured body and the turret of an MS-1 tank on top. It might protect against a machine gun if you were lucky, and at 40 kilometers an hour wasn't really any faster than light tanks on the roads, let alone off of them. The other major four-wheeled armoured car was the BA-20. For this, you start with a Ford V840 chassis, which initially is a little bit questionable, as that actually is a car, not a truck. Still, it seems to have worked out. This one entered production in 1936, and about 1,400 of them were in service by Barbarossa. It is worth noting that these are welded vehicles, reducing their weight, and the Soviets resisted the urge to overarm these ones with just a machine gun. Instead, about 2/3 had radios, either a fixed antenna or a whip. Find them in motorized armoured reconnaissance brigades. On good roads it was fast, and still provided some 15mm of armour. A few of the similar looking FAIs were kicking around as well, but they didn't last quite so long, being a little bit older and with only 6mm of armour. Probably due to the road conditions, or lack thereof, the Soviets tended to lean towards three-axle vehicles. Ford Timken provided the chassis for many of them, built locally as the GAZ AAA. The first major one was the BA3, almost 200 of which were made. This basically gave you a T-26 light tank's firepower on a vehicle of under 5.5 tons. Now, really, it just basically put a T-26 turret on top. Mobility concerns led to an improvement in the BA6, which incorporated a greater proportion of welding, so it was lighter, a shorter wheelbase, and it also had fewer cooling problems. 380 or so of these were made, but the Soviets figured they could do better. Still, the 45mm gun provided quite a punch, dangerous to most enemy tanks, and the half-track kits provided reasonable mobility during the Winter War. The big one was BA-10, of which over 3,000 were made. This three-axle armoured car, better all around than the BA-6, partially due to more slope on the armour, came with the same 45mm gun of the light tanks and 2 machine guns. These were intended basically to fight, not just conduct reconnaissance. And just in armoured cars now, the Soviets seemed to more or less match the number of panzers that were coming at them. However, the vehicles were later pushed out of the frontline role and almost exclusively into heavy reconnaissance by the end of 1941. In the end though, the Soviets decided that recon was best performed by smaller vehicles, leading to the BA-64 of next year. Not a bad vehicle for just over 5 tons though. Still, we're talking armoured cars on Russian terrain. Tracks are better, so let's move on to the lights. As I mentioned in the Doctrine video, it took the Soviets quite some time to decide how it wanted to use tanks, but that didn't stop them from buying the things in large numbers on the basis that it was easier to have the tanks and figure out what to do with them than it was to figure out what to do with them and then hope you didn't need them before they were procured. With some 23,000 tanks in Soviet service in June 1941, they basically had more than half the world's tank inventory at the time. Your standard combat tank, mainly for infantry support, is the T-26. This is basically a Soviet take on the highly influential interwar Vickers 6-tonner, which was reliable, affordable, easy to build, and it is easy to overlook the improvements in between the ones which left the factory in 1931 and those which rolled off the line in 1940. You started with a riveted tank with 2 turrets, each with a machine gun. They only built 1,600 of those, only. Just over a quarter of them would have had a small 37mm cannon placed into the right turret eventually. The suspension may not have been well suited for high-speed off-road, but it worked and it was reliable. The mainstay variant is the single cylindrical turret manufactured 1933 to 1938 with one or other of the 45mm guns. They were very capable, especially for the time, though the rate of fire was low on the model 1934 tank gun as the recoil from firing anything other than armor piercing was insufficient to automatically eject the spent casing. Welding started to be incorporated in both hull and turret by 1935, and ammunition was reduced in favor of fuel and radios on many tanks. By the time you get to 1938, a new sloped turret is in use with a rear-facing machine gun normally deleted. There is a vertically stabilized gun sight fitted, and the final version of the 1940 sees overhanging sponsons with sloped armor, almost double the fuel capacity, and a weight just shy of 10.5 tons, but that did get an extra 7 horsepower on top of the extra 90 just to help out. The tanks were equipped with both periscopic and direct vision sights, but no cupola for the TC. Vision in general kinda sucked, with the use of direct vision slots, and the 2-man turret crew had obvious liabilities. Still, this is an early 1930s tank which is fairly viable at the beginning of the war, had a reasonable record of success in Spain, but the Soviets were certainly well aware that they were becoming out of date. Of the 10,000 or so on strength in June 1941, about 4,100 were in the border military districts and in serviceable condition. As a result, the tanks were a mainstay of the Soviet forces, and really they're about on a par with the Panzer 35T overall in capability, and a threat to, although nowhere near as good as, the Panzer III. The other 1930 tank on its way out is the BT. This is the famous Christie convertible acquired from the US in 1930 and upgraded. It seems difficult to find photographs of the Soviets actually using the convertible feature, but the mechanism was retained all the way through BT's production run. The original BT-2, built to imperial measurements, and the BT-3, built to metric measurements, were otherwise identical and normally only referred to as BT-2. The vehicle was officially removed from service in 1940, but almost 600 of the 620 were still on hand and thus put to use. Not that their use was fantastic. We're talking here about two-man tanks bolted together, and the vast majority were armed with twin machine guns. They had only been in production under 2 years when they were replaced on the production line by the 1900 BT-5s. These were vast improvements, still predominantly bolted together, or riveted at least, but given a two-man turret with a bustle, very similar to that on T-26. It's also given the same Model 1932 gun as earlier T-26s, which was fairly capable of killing a Panzer III at most angles and ranges. Also, like T-26, these are still petrol engines, and they also have periscopic and direct vision sights, but are lacking a cupola for all-around vision. 1 in 4 of the BT-5s came equipped with radio. When you get to the BT-7, you start getting to a very good tank by 1935 standards when mass production started. 4,600 of them were built, almost half with radios. For about 14 tons, you get a vehicle which would do 50 kilometers an hour on tracks, wasn't slow off-road either, came with a 45mm gun capable of killing pretty much anything fielded by anyone, and the M17T V12 petrol engine was so good that it had to be detuned from 600 horsepower to 400 in order that the transmission could handle it. Both 3 and 4-speed transmissions were provided. There were some reliability issues that needed to be worked out. By 1938, they were coming with an improved gun with an electrical trigger and stabilized sights, though later production deleted the stabilizer as it was felt that it took too long to teach the troops how to use it effectively. A number were also fitted with infrared gear for night driving. The ultimate version was the BT-7M, also known as BT-8. 800 of these were built. They changed their engine to the V2 diesel, the same as on T-34, which gave it very long legs and a fair bit of get up and go. On the downside, running on wheels was all but prohibited. The road wheel rubber simply couldn't take the extra weight. Finally, there were about 100 BT-7As, the artillery version made with a short 76mm gun to give a bit of a high explosive punch, but they were obviously a minority. These vehicles, on paper, thus have much to recommend them. So where's the catch? Well, the piper has to be paid somehow. Though the 45mm gun gave it the capability to engage almost every contemporary tank out there, the armour was sufficiently light that basically anything heavier than a machine gun is equally a threat to it. Fortunately for the Soviets, the Japanese tanks that they encountered were optimised for killing soft targets, not tanks. Against their German opposition, the far smaller Panzer II was arguably an equal threat at least, and the Panzer III more of one, because of the capability of the very well designed 3-man turret. BT's turret was fairly cramped, though the turret ring did more or less match up to the inside wall of the hull, and it had no turret basket. The vision out was also not what a late 1930s tank would be expected to have. Of course, the Soviets were not blind to this. They knew that even BT-7 was obsolescent, so they had started a replacement program for it. At the onset of the German invasion, the Red Army had a fleet of about 7,500 BTs in service. The Western Military District had some 400 BT-2s, 875 BT-5s, and 3,200 BT-7s. Now, you will recall that I had said that the Soviets were building tanks without knowing quite what to do with them, and this applies both to BT and T-26. Both were purchased because they seemed to be good tanks, not because they necessarily filled any doctrinal role, which had not yet been identified. Indeed, the BTs were for a while placed in the infantry support role as well before being moved to other echelons such as mechanized cavalry. By the early 1930s, though, the Red Army has decided that there was a reconnaissance function which light tanks could perform. Mobility was to be more important than armament or armour, so these light tracked vehicles had to be fast and they had to float. They also found a role later as infantry support vehicles to include supporting river crossings. The T-37A and T-38 were almost the same vehicle, the latter being a bit more reliable, and you can tell the difference by noting that the T-37A's turret is on the right and the T-38's on the left. 1 in 3 of the 2,500 T-37As had radios, but 1 in 9 of the 1,200 T-38s did. This tank was not particularly successful. After buying those nearly 4,000 tanks, it was realized that they were terrible. For starters, for amphibious tanks, they tended to sink a lot, which is something of a failure to meet design specifications. They had almost no reserve buoyancy at all. So you put one bloke on the back and it sinks. The engine cooling system didn't. The low power to weight ratio from the 40 horsepower engine may have been able to get the vehicle to nearly 40 km/h on a straight and level, but it certainly didn't cut the mustard off-road. As of 1st June 1941, the Red Army still had 3,500 T-37As and T-38s, of which 1,300 T-37As and 600 were T-38s and actually able to fight. Surprisingly, though most didn't last until August, a few score were still fighting and crossing rivers in mid-1944. Given the apparent atrociousness of the T-38, it is not surprising that the Soviets looked to build a better one. By the onset of the German invasion, the Soviets do seem to have figured out light tanks. The first replacement was a T-40. Running an 85 horsepower petrol engine, this 6-ton tank actually floated reliably. One couldn't complain too much about the armament of a 12.7mm Dushka with a coaxial 7.62 either, nor the fact that it's running torsion bar suspension. Unfortunately, being the first Soviet torsion bar tank, and also being a very short one, it tended to make the crew motion sick, as they didn't think to put any shocks to control the rocking. It only had a 1/4 inch of armor though, because, hey, they didn't want it to sink. About 200 were built by the time Barbarossa started, but the units were still trying to figure them out. 18 out of 132 on hand were capable of operation. Almost none survived past July. In the meantime, it was decided that numbers mattered more than amphibious capability, so a land-only version, T-40S, was made. By September, 136 of these were made, a third of which were converted to multiple rocket launchers instead. In the meantime, starting August 41, a heavy armor version with all of a 1/2 inch of armor started being built. This is T-30. 335 of them were to be built, and since they weren't worried about saving weight anymore, they replaced the 12.7mm with a 20mm belt-fed cannon. By the standards of Red Army production, T-40 and its derivatives weren't an important percentage of the fleet, but even those few hundred were a significant proportion of their German opposition. It is a shame only a few score T-50s were made before the German invasion. It was developed with experience both of the Winter War and an evaluation of Panzer III in mind. Well-sloped armor, a 3-man turret to operate the 45mm gun, a cupola for the TC to stick his head up, a radio next to the commander, and a 300 horsepower diesel V6, all rolling on torsion bar suspension with shock absorbers this time, for less than 14 tons. This was to be the new main tank of the Soviet Army, with 14,000 ordered for production at the time that only 600 T-34s were on order. And it would have been at least equal to, if not better, than the Panzer III, at under 2/3 the weight, if it could be built. At least until you get to Panzer III upgrades, but hey, both sides had a little bit of room for improvement. Sadly though, it could not be built, although one did hang around in Finnish Army service until the mid-1950s. They stopped at those, I think it's like 64 tanks. It was, though, an example of how the Soviets could really build a very good tank if they set their minds to it. The T-60 will join the fray in a few months, being produced by the 1,000. Think of it as a land-only improvement on T-40, but we'll talk a bit more about that at a future time.
So that was Soviet armored cars and light armor. It's a pretty mixed bag, and they obviously need a long time to work out their armor doctrine. Probably the overall theme is that mobility is a chief concern, and you will soon see in my regular series how this only becomes more and more important as the autumn and winter months roll around. It is lucky for the Soviets that they have just about figured things out, and they do clearly have the ability to build excellent tanks. They just have some catching up to do. So join us next week for Chieftain's deep dive into the Soviet medium and heavy tanks. And don't forget to subscribe to both of our channels if you have not already done so. See you next time. I'm in.
Vehicle was room for the third crew in the oncoming invasion of France. As per some of the previous videos, you will forgive me for not yet having a teleprompter. I shall be referring to my strategically placed monitor off to the left. Now, I tend to have rather a strong dislike for vehicle comparisons, as if tanks were designed and operated in a vacuum. They meet each other on the field of honor, dueling. Well, instead, tanks are usually used as a subset of a much larger force, much as artillery would be, or air, or obstacles. A tank is designed to meet a set of criteria, and these criteria are inherently subjective. What is important to one designer or one doctrinaire need not necessarily be just as important to another. And neither of them need necessarily be wrong. It's all dependent on the situation that the designing nation finds itself. Now, I already have the 3 videos out covering the doctrine and the development of the doctrine of the 3 major powers that we're about to discuss. And if you haven't seen them yet, hop on over and check them out. You'll find them, I would go back to the World War II channel homepage on YouTube, look for the playlist called Hardware, and you'll find the links to the 3 of them there. And I'll see you back here in about 2.5 to 3 hours. Otherwise, let us go on. Now, the other issue, as I've alluded to in the past, is that there's far more to a tank than just having a big gun and armor. I mean, if there was, then the Germans wouldn't be making both Panzer IVs and a Tiger at the same time. In modern American parlance, you expect a tank in battle to be able to shoot, move, and communicate. I'm told, it's popped up in a YouTube comment, I think, that the Germans today actually shoot, communicate, move, and then shoot. But whatever, the same general gist. A tank needs to be where it is going to have the right effect at the right time, and it needs to be able to coordinate its actions. A tank is a system, not a weapon, and the measure of effectiveness is not armor thickness, maximum speed, sight magnification, or anything else like that. These are all means to an end. The end is still on target. You got to be in the right place at the right time with the right equipment to do the job. As Ralph Roths, the Panzer Museum director, observed in one of my interviews with him, the Germans won all their greatest victories in World War II with the smaller, less powerful tanks, and all their great losses when they had the biggest, meanest things on the battlefield. A possible exception, maybe the ISs. So this video is not simply going to be rehashing the armor specifications of the penetration tables, which you can easily find on Google with a search. I mean, if you're absolutely desperate to know the penetration value for Panzergranate 40 37mm round, go look it up, instead of listening to me ramble off figures, which will be very boring and you'll forget them all anyway. And besides, I would also observe that whatever the paper specifications say about values, real life tends not to care. Neither do the soft and squishy things inside the tank, which are just as susceptible to psychology and significant emotional events as your typical rifleman. Now, neither is this going to be an in-depth assessment of the various vehicles. There's a lot of them to cover. And if you want to really watch or listen to me spend half an hour to 45 minutes going over a single tank, I have plenty of such videos over on my channel. I'll mention the ones relevant to this video as I hit them. So that sets the parameters for the video, and now to the campaign. And since the Germans have elected to serve, let's start with them. Now, the Germans learned a few lessons after their experience with Poland, and one of which was that the tank units were too tank heavy. And this was a common failing of pretty much all the tank using nations, but because the Germans had the first practical experience, they also were the first to change it and fix it. The realization struck that even tank units needed a lot of infantry. And if you were fortunate enough to be a Panzer Grenadier who actually got to ride in an APC instead of a truck, The chances were that the APC in question was going to be an SDKFZ 250 or 251. The former looks pretty much a lot like the latter, it's just a bit smaller, and was used for transporting smaller sections or command elements, that sort of thing, observation posts for artillery. The infantry units tended to use the 251s. Now, German half-tracks have always struck me as being a little bit of an odd duck. They were very complicated machines and had a lot of liabilities to go with various positives. Now, the Germans were certainly not the first to try out the half-track idea. The British and the French had been doing it for quite some time, at least a decade earlier, and that's where the Germans got the idea. So one of their observers that was going around the different countries saw the French Congress and decided it was worth a look. And for whatever reason, though, the Germans were the only ones to take up the half-track mantle. The British and the French decided to go for full-track solutions. In the end, the only significant other half-track player was the United States, and their philosophy for half-track design was actually somewhat different to the German ones. It is probably best to describe a German half-track as a full-track vehicle with an auxiliary steering capability. The wheels provided for some shallow steering without losing any power or speed, making the vehicles very quick and efficient, especially on highways, When you needed to do a sharper turn, the track system would kick in with the steering just as it would on a regular tank. So these were not simple vehicles, and if I recall my conversation with Hilary Dorr correctly, the director or the manager of the factory that was producing SDKFZ-8s said that for every 3 of those that he was making, he could make 5 Panthers. They also had what I can only conclude was a rather irritating design flaw. The tracks were lubricated, they were wet tracks, meaning that every single track link, now go look at a photo of it, has a bolt that you gotta open up when the track is in the right position to do it, when the link is in the right position, and then you got to fill it with lubricant on occasion. And I can only imagine how enamored the troops would have been of such a requirement. On the plus side, though, the half-tracks that the Germans had did provide excellent protection for the weight. The German alloys of the time were somewhat superior to those of their opponents, and the armor plates were also very well sloped. At least that's the design. I mean, in practice, I'm not entirely sure what it is that a 251 would stop, but let's say a Lorraine would not stop. I don't find it very likely that a 251 would stop a 25mm anti-tank round from the French anti-tank gun, for example, or maybe even a Boy's .55. But the half-track did mean that the German infantry could keep up with the tanks and fight alongside them in the front line. And I'll bet you thought I was just going to talk about the tanks. As I said, there's more to the battlefield than just tanks, and especially in World War II, the rifleman is arguably more important. Also important, and often overlooked and unloved, the eyes of the German army, the Spähwagens. Now, the primary scout car of the Panzerspäh companies was a variant of the 221. It's a 4x4. It was designed from the ground up as the German army's first purpose-designed armored car, instead of earlier conversions basically of civilian chassis. These things had four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, and were capable of 80 kilometers an hour. A company was authorized 10 of these 221s. They're two-man vehicles and they're armed with a machine gun. A company would also have 4 222s, which has a 20mm and a machine gun, provide a little bit of heavier firepower. This was the vehicle made famous as Lieutenant Gruber's little tank. If you're old enough, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The turrets on both vehicles, well, okay, technically the 221 wasn't a turret, it was more of a 360-degree rotating shield, but same general idea, is open top. You often see it maybe with the cage on the top. So it allowed for good vision for the crew and also allowed for a very high angle of elevation in the event that some wandering airplane overhead needed to be deterred. Encouraged to go that away. By 1940, some improvements to the original design had been made, such as increasing the frontal armor to 14.5mm. They changed the weapons to more modern designs of the same caliber. An improvement which had not been incorporated by 1940, however, was the radio. There wasn't one, which begs the obvious question. It's all very well finding the enemy, but the whole point of the exercise is to tell the commanders where the enemy is. Enter thus the SEKFZ 223. Again, 4 per company, and this is the radio car. This basically is a reconfigured 221 to make room for a third man who is the radio operator. So, by use of hand or flag signals, the scout cars could relay information to the radio car, which would then relay up the line. And presumably for more detailed reporting, they'd park somewhere and the commander of one car would walk over and get on the radio direct. The heavier punch of the recon companies, such as it was provided by the 6 heavy armoured cars. And usually they were 3 231s and 3 232s. In early 1940, most of these were the 6 RADs, 6-wheeled vehicles, which had very limited off-road mobility, but a couple dozen of the new 8 RADs had entered service. By May 1940, these were still designated as the 233 and 234 armoured cars, but as an example of the practical interchangeability, the 8-wheelers were redesignated as 231 and 232 as well, with 6 RAD or 6 RAD or 8 RAD in brackets afterwards. And unit reporting often did not differentiate. They had a 231, 232, and you had to somehow find out by other sources exactly what kind of vehicle that was. And Hilary Doyle finds that very irritating. In fact, a lot of the reporting is just unser Wagen, our vehicles. You got to know. The 234 designation would come back again as a designation in late 1940, but that is after the period that we're talking about here. Now, again, these vehicles are armed with a 2cm and a machine gun, and they did not come with radios. Only the 232s had those. The off-road mobility, even of the 8-wheel vehicles, was such that the recon troops requested full tracked. But for now, it was decided that the 80 kilometers an hour which they were capable of doing on roads was worth the loss of off-road capability. And so we come to the tanks. Yay! The Germans used about 2,500 tanks in the invasion of France, of a pretty whopping 6 types, which must have made the logisticians kind of mad. Of course, that wasn't the main intent. The goal was Panzer II,